The morning came pale and cold, the kind that made every breath a ghost. She stood outside the cabin with her hands wrapped tight around a dented tin cup, steam curling toward a sky the color of washed bone. The grass around her lay brittle and yellow, the wind running through it like fingers over dry paper. Somewhere far off, a crow cried once, the sound sharp enough to echo in her ribs. She sipped her coffee slowly, holding it longer on her tongue than she meant to, as if it could delay the day from beginning. Inside, her husband moved with the heavy tread of a man already displeased. The floorboards spoke beneath his boots. She didn't turn when the door opened behind her, but the air shifted, the scent of tobacco and wool coat came with him. He looked over the land as though it were an adversary, jaw tight beneath a thin beard. "Sky's wrong for this time of year," he muttered. She didn't answer. Her replies had grown scarce lately, trimmed down to what could not be twisted against her. They had been married 4 years. 4 winters, 3 droughts, 1 plague that had taken their best cow in a single day. He'd begun to speak of these misfortunes as though they'd come from her shadow. Once, long ago, his hand had rested at the small of her back when they walked. Now it hung at his side like a weapon never drawn but always waiting. She turned her eyes to the horizon. Out there, the line between earth and sky wavered with heat even in winter, as if the land itself were holding a fever. The Comanche Trail passed somewhere beyond that shimmer. Sometimes she saw riders there, their silhouettes as still as carved wood against the sun. She had never told him that one of their women came sometimes, quiet as a deer, to trade herbs for sewing needles or sugar. It would only have been another nail in her coffin. When the first calf of spring was born still, he'd watched her too long. That night at the supper table, the lamplight made his eyes look darker than they were, and the silence between them grew thick enough to choke on. In town, whispers slid along the edges of her hearing. A woman at the mercantile leaned closer to another and said the word, witchery, like it tasted bitter. She had walked home slower that day, letting the weight of it press her down into the dust. Yet she was not strange, not truly. She hummed to calm the milk cow during milking, the same low song her mother had used. She could tell when rain was near by the way ants scurried before the clouds formed. She set broken wings in splints of willow and twine. If that made her unnatural, then so be it. But there were things a man feared more than a storm, and one was a wife he could not understand. The wind caught her hair now, blowing it against her cheek. She tucked it back, but the movement drew his gaze. It stayed on her too long, like a candle flame bending toward what it might burn. They spoke little as the morning bled into afternoon. She worked the washboard, hands red and raw in the icy water, the sound of it scraping in steady rhythm. He mended a fence post near the barn, though his eyes came back to her between each hammer's fall. She felt them as surely as a hand on her shoulder. Later, as the sun tilted toward the west, she carried a pail to the chicken coop. Inside, the air was warm and close. She reached for an egg, the shell warm against her palm, when a shadow crossed the doorway. She looked up to see him there, leaning in without entering. His voice was even, almost soft. "Saw you by the cottonwood yesterday," he said, talking to the air. Her mouth opened, then closed. She had been alone, at least she thought she had. The cottonwood was where she went to breathe when the cabin pressed too tightly around her. "I was humming," she said. "Humming to who?" he asked. The egg cooled in her hand. "No one," she said, and put it gently in the basket. He stayed there a moment longer, watching her as though the truth might slip from her skin without words. Then he stepped back, and the daylight returned to the doorway. That night supper passed in silence. The stew was thin. She ate slowly, aware of his eyes flicking up to her face every few spoonfuls. The lamplight swayed with the draft, shadows stretching long fingers over the table. Outside, coyotes yipped in the distance. He set down his spoon, the sound loud in the small room. "It isn't right, the way things go wrong around here," he said. "A man notices patterns." Her pulse quickened, though her face stayed still. She set her spoon beside her bowl. "Patterns? The calf. The corn last season. That hawk that near took my eye." He gestured toward the thin scar at his temple. Every one of 'em, you were near enough to touch. The words settled between them like stones dropped into water. She could not answer without betraying herself in some way, so she gathered the bowls and rose to wash them. The clink of tin was the only sound until he stood too, pushing back his chair. She felt him behind her, his breath on her neck. Some things need facing, he said quietly, almost kindly. Sooner than later. Her hands tightened on the bowl, water dripping over her knuckles. She kept her eyes on the suds until he moved away. When she looked up, the lamplight caught the edge of his cheekbone, sharp as a blade. Later, when he had gone to bed, she stepped outside. The moon hung low and pale, its light painting the prairie in shades of silver and shadow. She walked toward the cottonwood, the grass whispering under her skirts. At the base of the tree, she touched the bark, rough and cold under her palm. It felt steadier than the ground beneath her feet. A sound pricked her ears, soft, rhythmic, not the wind. She turned her head toward the far dark, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw movement, a shape that did not belong to the trees. It stood still, watching. The hair at the back of her neck rose. Then it was gone, melting into the night as if it had never been. She stayed there longer than she meant to, her fingers resting on the cottonwood's heart. The prairie stretched out endless before her, full of things unseen and waiting. When she finally turned back toward the cabin, the door stood open. He was there in the doorway, just a shadow against the lamplight, his face unreadable. The wind shifted then, carrying the faintest scent of wood smoke from somewhere far beyond their land. And in that moment, without knowing why, she felt the first true shiver of the storm that was coming. The sky wore a strange color that morning, a pale brass light filtering through clouds that seemed to hang too low. She stood at the basin, washing her hands in water gone cold, when the door closed behind her without a sound. His presence filled the room before his voice did. "We're going out," he said, as if it were nothing, his tone flat and decided. She dried her hands slowly, the towel's coarse weave rough against her skin. "Out where?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his coat, pulling it on with a kind of grim ritual. "To the cottonwood," he said at last, the name of the place heavy between them. She hesitated, a wet thread of unease winding through her chest. Still, she reached for her shawl. He watched her wrap it close, his eyes sharp as frost. Outside, the wind carried the smell of iron and damp earth, a smell that came before storms. The grass hissed in its own language. He walked ahead without looking back, and she followed, her boots pressing into the cold ground with the hollow sound of surrender. The cottonwood waited like an old sentinel, its bare limbs rattling against the wind. He stopped beneath it, his shoulders set, hands working the rope he had carried without her noticing. She opened her mouth to ask, no, to demand, but his look silenced her. He stepped toward her, the rope uncoiling like a snake waking from winter sleep. "What are you doing?" The question escaped before she could hold it. His voice was low, almost coaxing, as if explaining to a stubborn child. "I can't have you bringing more curses to this land. They say God sees truth best when a soul is left alone to face him. I'm giving you that chance." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She took a step back, but his hand was fast, catching her arm. The rope brushed her wrist like a warning before it bit in tight. She gasped at the suddenness, at the cold surety in his grip. He led her to the tree, pressing her back against its rough trunk. Bark scraped through her shawl. He wound the rope around her wrists and the trunk, each pull firm, final. The wind snatched at her hair, pulling strands loose to whip across her eyes. "This isn't God's will," she said, the words thin against the air. "It's his judgment you'll meet here," he replied, knotting the rope with a sailor's precision. His breath came quick, not with exertion but with something darker, conviction sharpened to cruelty. When he stepped back, the rope dug into her skin, holding her in the cold embrace of the cottonwood. She could feel the tree's old heart beating slow beneath her spine, or maybe it was her own blood rushing in panic. He studied her as if committing the image to memory. "If you're innocent," he said, "the Lord will spare you. If not—" He left the sentence open, letting the silence finish it for him. He turned and walked away without another word, his boots thudding over frozen earth until they faded into the wind. She called his name once, but it vanished before it reached him. Then there was nothing but the restless whisper of grass and the groan of the tree. The hours stretched thin. The cold found every seam in her clothing, slipping beneath fabric to press its teeth against her skin. Her fingers stiffened until she could barely feel them. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sliding across the ground like a hand searching for something to claim. She thought of the kitchen fire, of the steam rising from a pot, of warmth she would not feel again if night came too soon. A memory rose unbidden, her mother's voice telling her as a girl that trees could carry messages if you pressed your ear to them. She leaned back against the cottonwood now, listening, not for a message, but for the life inside it, the slow sap, the unseen roots gripping deep. She told herself she could hold on as long as the tree did. Once she heard hoofbeats far off, a lonely rhythm swallowed quickly by the wind. She strained to see, but the horizon offered only the wavering blur of heat rising from cold ground. A trick of the air, she thought. Or perhaps some passing rider who would not look her way even if he saw her. By late afternoon, the light had thinned to a strange gold, the kind that made every shadow stretch too long. Her lips were cracked, her breath raw in her throat. She watched a small bird land on a low branch, tilting its head at her as if puzzled. It hopped closer, fearless, and then away again, vanishing into the grasses. Even the wild things did not see her as a threat, only as part of the landscape. The sun dropped lower, bleeding out behind a smear of clouds. Her thoughts wandered in and out, light and heavy, as if her mind were a lantern swaying on a weak hook. She imagined him back at the cabin, eating his supper without hurry, perhaps telling himself this was justice. She wondered if he would return at dawn to find her gone cold, if he would weep or simply nod as though the proof had been delivered. A sharp crack of wood snapped her back to the present. She turned her head as far as the rope allowed, scanning the thinning light. At first she saw nothing but the trembling of grass in the wind. Then a movement. Slow. Deliberate. A shape slipping between the trees not far off. Tall, broad-shouldered, its outlines softened by distance and dusk. Her breath caught, fogging in front of her face. Whoever it was moved with an unhurried grace, the way a predator might when nothing could outrun it. The figure paused, half hidden by a stand of scrub oak. She could not see the face, only the stillness, watching. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent unfamiliar yet ancient, a mix of smoke and earth and something wilder still. She held her breath without meaning to. The figure stepped forward once, the faint crunch of frost beneath a boot or a moccasin, she could not tell which. Then it stopped again, as if considering her from a place beyond judgment. She wanted to call out, but her throat felt too tight. Instead, she met the gaze she could not quite see, willing whatever it was to understand, she was not meant for this place, for this ending. The figure remained, a dark promise against the dying light. And in that suspended moment she felt the fragile thread between despair and deliverance pull taut. Somewhere deep in her bones she knew, this was not the end her husband had chosen for her. It would be another's choice now. The shape moved again, stepping into a shaft of fading light, and she saw him clearly for the first time. A man, tall and sinewed, his shoulders wrapped in a thick hide the color of storm clouds. The wind toyed with a strand of black hair that had escaped the leather cord binding it. His eyes caught the dim light, dark, deep, holding the stillness of a winter night before snow falls. Across his back, a bough rested, the curve of it graceful as a crescent moon. He did not speak. He only looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something more than her life. The air between them held its breath. Then he closed the distance, each step deliberate, making no more sound than the wind in the grass. Up close, his presence felt like the earth itself had leaned nearer. He carried the scent of smoke and sage, of fires burned in places untouched by fences. His gaze moved from the raw rope marks on her wrists to her pale, stiff fingers, and something unreadable flickered in his face. A knife appeared in his hand, the blade small but keen. He reached for her bonds without hesitation. The steel whispered through the rope in a single motion, the tension snapping away. Her arms fell forward, heavy and clumsy, tingling as blood rushed back into them. She nearly stumbled, but his hand caught her elbow with a steadiness that grounded her. "You'll freeze if you stay," he said quietly, the first words between them. His voice was low, unhurried, touched with an accent shaped by the Comanche tongue. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to thank him or ask why he bothered. He took the decision from her, draping a thick bison hide blanket over her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate relief, the warmth seeping into her bones like sunlight finding frost. He gestured for her to follow, turning toward the trees. She moved as if through water, her legs stiff from hours of stillness. He slowed his pace to match hers. The shadows grew longer, the pale sky deepening into the muted blue of twilight. Somewhere far off, a wolf called, a single note, mournful and low. They reached a small shelter tucked between two leaning cottonwoods. It was little more than a frame of poles covered in hides, but the scent of smoke drifting from its entrance promised heat. He guided her inside. The air changed at once, warmer, scented with pine and something rich that had been cooking over the fire. She sank down beside the small blaze, holding her hands to it. Her skin prickled as feeling returned, each pulse of heat a sting of life. He poured water from a skin into a tin cup and offered it to her. She drank greedily, the coolness both soothing and shocking against her parched throat. He crouched nearby, watching her without intruding. His expression was neither pity nor curiosity, only a quiet assessment, as though he were learning her the way a man learns a new trail. When her shivering eased, he took a small pot from the fire and ladled out a thick broth into a wooden bowl. The taste was earthy and strong, the warmth spreading through her belly in steady waves. "I thought I was alone," she said after a while, her voice small in the hush. His eyes held hers, and for the first time she caught the faintest curve of a smile. "You weren't." They spoke little after that. Words felt unnecessary under the roof of the shelter, where the fire's crackle filled the spaces between them. She studied his movements, the quiet efficiency with which he added wood to the flames, how he stirred the pot without looking, trusting the motion. His hands were long-fingered, calloused in places that told of years with bow and blade. When the wind outside shifted, he glanced toward the opening as if listening to a voice she couldn't hear. Then he settled again, his focus returning to her. "You'll sleep here tonight," he said simply. "The cold can kill faster than hunger." She wanted to ask what would happen in the morning, but the thought of returning to the cabin, to the man who had bound her, froze her tongue. Instead she nodded, pulling the blanket tighter. Night deepened. The firelight painted his face in golden shadow, catching on the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar that ran from temple to cheekbone. He hummed once, low and tuneless, as he sharpened a small knife with a stone. The sound was oddly comforting, like the slow beat of a heart. When she lay down, he pulled another hide over her. She felt the weight of his presence even with her eyes closed, not as a threat but as a shield against the dark. Sleep came in fits, woven with dreams of snow melting under warm rain. Once, in the middle of the night, she woke to the soft sound of footsteps outside the shelter. She stiffened, but he was already moving toward the entrance, bow in hand. A brief rustle in the grass, the quiet snort of a deer, and he returned, setting the bough aside without a word. She watched him for a moment, the fire's glow catching the faint glint in his eyes. Something about him felt as old as the land, patient, deliberate, as if he carried entire seasons in his bones. Before sleep took her again, a thought settled in her mind with surprising certainty. This man had not simply found her. He had chosen to. The wind outside moaned low, pressing at the hides like a restless spirit. Somewhere far beyond the reach of the firelight, the cabin stood in darkness, its master perhaps sleeping soundly, certain she was gone from his world. But here, in this small pocket of warmth, another truth was taking root, quiet, persistent, unyielding as a seed beneath snow. And though the night was long, she knew dawn would bring something her husband had not counted on. She would not be returning alone. The morning came soft and white, a light frost gilding every blade of grass outside the shelter. She woke beneath the weight of the bison hide, the fire beside her reduced to a cradle of red coals. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet breathing of the man across the space. He sat cross-legged, working a length of rawhide with slow, precise movements, his eyes lowered but aware of her waking. He slid a bowl toward her without a word, steam rising from a thick porridge sweetened faintly with something floral. She took it in both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers before eating. They shared the small meal in companionable silence, broken only by the sigh of wind against the hides. When they stepped outside, the day felt wide and clear, the air sharpened by cold. He handed her a pair of snowshoes fashioned from bent willow and sinew. She stared at them, unsure. For walking when the snow's soft, he explained, fastening one to her boot before she could protest. His fingers were deft, confident, working the ties until they were snug. He showed her the slow, deliberate step that kept the shoes from tangling. Her first attempts were awkward, sending up small sprays of frost. He smiled faintly, not at her clumsiness but at her persistence. They moved through a meadow dusted with snow, their tracks stretching behind them like a stitched seam. He paused often, pointing to the faint impressions of deer hooves or the delicate scribble of a hare. She began to see the land as he did, a page written on overnight. In turn, she taught him the melody of an old hymn, humming the notes until he could match them. His voice was deeper than the tune required, but warm, unafraid of its own sound. Later, they gathered fallen branches for the fire. She bent to pick one and slipped on an icy patch, the bundle in her arms scattering. He caught her elbow before she fell, and for an instant their eyes met in a narrow band of sunlight between two trees. The moment was brief, but it seemed to settle something unspoken between them, a mutual understanding that no longer required constant explanation. Back at the shelter, they worked side by side. She mended a tear in one of the hides while he shaped arrow shafts from young saplings. The rhythm of shared labor wrapped around them like another kind of warmth. By afternoon, she found herself speaking more freely, telling him of her mother's garden, of the first calf she'd ever midwifed, of the river she used to swim as a girl. He listened without interrupting, as if each word were a seed worth planting. When the light began to thin, he took her to a low ridge that overlooked the valley. From there she could see the line of the horizon far beyond her husband's land, the prairie stretching out in waves of muted gold and gray. "That's where I hunt in summer," he said, pointing to a cluster of dark hills. She imagined him moving across that open space, unseen except by the wind. For a while they stood without speaking, the view holding them in place. Then a sound cut across the quiet, a single rifle shot, far off but distinct. He stilled, his gaze sharpening toward the north. Another shot followed after a long breath. She felt the change in him, a taut readiness coiling under his calm. "Travelers?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, but the word carried no conviction. His eyes stayed on the distance, measuring something she could not see. After a moment he turned back toward the shelter. "We should keep the fire low tonight." They returned as the sky flushed with the last light of day. Inside, the smaller fire cast a closer circle of warmth. She could feel the unease in his movements, though he said nothing more about the gunshots. Over the evening meal, he asked about the rope burns on her wrists, running a finger lightly over the marks. "Does it hurt?" "Not as much as it did," she said. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "A man doesn't tie a woman like that unless he's already decided she's his enemy." The truth in his words cut deeper than she expected. She realized she had not thought of herself as her husband's enemy before, but now she saw how close they had been living to that quiet war. Night came early, the wind keening low outside. They lay down under separate hides, though she could sense his nearness. Sleep was slow to come, her mind circling back to the shots on the wind, the way his shoulders had gone still at the sound. Somewhere in her chest, a strange blend of safety and dread took root. In the small hours, she woke to find the fire nearly gone and the shelter darker than before. The cold had crept in like a thief. She pulled the hide tighter around her shoulders and listened. At first she heard nothing but the wind. Then, another sound. Faint, distant, yet unmistakable, The low murmur of men's voices carried on the night air. Her breath caught. She turned her head toward him. He was awake, eyes open, listening to the same sound. He held a finger to his lips, though she had made no noise. The voices faded, swallowed by the wind, but the stillness they left behind felt heavy with promise. He rose without a word, moving to check the bough leaning by the entrance. His movements were soundless, precise, born of long habit. She sat up, clutching the hide, the sudden understanding settling cold in her gut. Whoever was out there was not lost, and they were not harmless. When he met her eyes, there was no need for words. She saw it there, clear as the frost on the grass, that the world beyond this shelter was shifting toward them, and it would not wait politely for morning. Dawn bled slow and cold over the valley, the frost still clinging stubbornly to the grass. She stood at the shelter's edge, the bison hide drawn around her shoulders, watching her breath rise in the still air. He was already moving with quiet purpose, checking the bowstring, testing the edge of his knife. No words passed between them. The weight of the night's voices still lay over them like a thin sheet of ice. It wasn't long before the sound of hoofs came, faint at first, then clearer, a steady, deliberate approach. She knew that rhythm. It lived in her bones. Her husband rode like a man who believed the earth should part for him. When he crested the rise, 2 other men flanked him. All 3 bore the stiff postures of those who came not to search but to claim. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. The hunter stepped forward, placing himself between her and the riders. He said nothing, simply stood with his bow lowered but ready, his presence alone a warning. Her husband's gaze swept over the small shelter, landing on her like a cold hand. "So it's true," he said, his voice carrying too easily in the morning air. "You didn't die out here. You just traded my roof for another man's." She stayed silent. He had a way of twisting words into nooses. She would not offer him the rope. "You think this one will keep you?" He gestured toward the hunter with a tilt of his chin. "He's not your kind. He'll leave you when it suits him. I'm your husband. You belong with me." The hunter's voice came calm, steady. "She belongs to no man." Her husband's face tightened, a muscle jumping at his jaw. One of the men beside him shifted uneasily, glancing at the bow in the hunter's hands. But her husband leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes fixed on her. "You'll regret standing against me. This land is mine. You can't live here without my say." Something in her broke then, not in weakness, but in finality. She stepped out from behind the hunter, the frost crunching under her boots. The air felt sharp in her lungs. "You speak of land and roofs as if they were chains," she said. "You tied me to a tree and left me to freeze, and now you come speaking of belonging. I owe you nothing." A flicker crossed his face, surprise, then something darker. "You've been turned," he muttered. "Poisoned by kindness," she cut in. "By a man who saw me as more than a curse." Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The truth was louder than any shout. He shifted in the saddle, his certainty faltering under the weight of her words. The hunter stood motionless beside her, his quiet presence like bedrock. One of the other men cleared his throat. "Maybe we should go," he murmured to her husband, but was ignored. "I could drag you home now," her husband said, the threat curling like smoke. "You could try," she answered. The space between them seemed to tighten, the cold air charged with something about to break. Her husband's hand twitched toward the rifle slung across his back. Before he could touch it, the hunter moved, not fast, but with such precision that speed was irrelevant. His bow came up, the arrow drawn in a single fluid breath. The line between them was no longer just words. It was wood and string and the sure knowledge of what could follow. The 2 men flanking her husband backed their horses a few steps. The frost beneath the hooves crackled in the silence. Her husband's eyes darted from the hunter's bow to her face. Something passed there, recognition, perhaps, that this fight was already lost. He let out a short breath, half a scoff, half a surrender. "You'll see the truth one day," he said. But the words rang hollow. He turned his horse, the others falling in behind, their departure as slow and deliberate as their arrival. She stood still until the sound of hooves faded into the distance, the frost beginning to melt where the sun touched it. Only then did she feel the tremor in her hands. The hunter lowered his bow and glanced at her, his expression unreadable but steady. "You're free to choose," he said quietly. She looked toward the horizon where the riders had vanished, then back at him. Freedom tasted strange on her tongue, like air too clean after a lifetime in dust. She thought of the cottonwood tree, of the rope biting her wrists, of the silent hours waiting for a rescue she hadn't believed would come. And she thought of the quiet fire, the lessons in reading the snow, the hymns sung under a cold sky. "I've already chosen," she said. He gave a small nod, as if he'd known all along. The sun was higher now, spilling gold over the frost-bitten grass. The land seemed to open before them, wide and without boundaries. They walked together toward the ridge, the hunter leading with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. From the top, the valley stretched in every direction, the sky a vast, unbroken blue. She felt the wind press against her, not as resistance but as a welcome. "This is where you live?" she asked. "This is where I belong," he said. She let the words settle inside her, feeling the quiet weight of their truth. For the first time in years, she didn't think about where she had come from or what had been taken from her. She thought only of the ground beneath her boots, the air in her lungs, and the man beside her who had stepped into her life without asking for anything in return. Somewhere below, the cottonwood stood alone in the field, its bare branches rattling softly in the wind. She imagined the ropes gone, the scars fading, the tree left to stand in peace. She closed her eyes for a moment, the sunlight warm against her face. In that stillness, she understood something simple and certain: survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. When she opened her eyes, the hunter was watching her, as if he, too, knew there was more road ahead than behind. She smiled faintly, pulling the hide closer around her shoulders. Far off, a hawk wheeled high above the prairie, its cry sharp against the wide silence. And with that sound she felt the last thread tying her to the man who had left her to die finally snap free.